Welcome to another episode of The Focal Thought. My guest today is Neil Gonsalves. How are you, Neil?
Good. I'm great. Thank you. Thank you for having me on your show.
No, you're welcome. Anytime. I'm excited to speak with you today on diversity and culture. This is a topic that you are very familiar with, and you are a writer, a columnist, a TEDx speaker, and you've been in the post-secondary sector for 20 years. You've got lots of field experience in this topic. And this is something, that's very sort of personal to me because I've grown up in countries and cities that have been very diverse. Just,
Mhm.
the way our family moved around. And I've never really sort of been in a situation where I've had one culture, one religion, one world view. And, when you're speaking of diversity, if you go on the internet, they talk about maybe, different types of diversity.
Of
The
course.
main ones are, I guess, internal diversity. So, as humans, we think we're all the same, but inside, we're really not. Even though we come from flesh and blood, which are the basic building blocks and, chemical ingredients, we have
Sure.
different sort of genetic setup codes, and we have, different skin colors, different hair types. So we
Hmm.
are diverse in an internal setting, right? In our gender, our, sexual orientation, physical ability, things like that. We've
Right.
got external diversity. So, these are things that, contain aspects of religion, appearance, location, where you grow up. We've got organizational diversity that they speak of in the workplace, with
Hmm.
job functions, the work that you do, right? The different department, the management levels. And then we've got worldview diversity, right? So this is sort of encompassing everything. So beliefs, your politics, your travel. And then, we can go on and on. But I think it's important because too often we sort of get bogged down into a very sort of tunnel vision mode. And I think diversity really helps to sort of break that. And, I want to get into some of this with you. So first off, I wanted to
Sure.
ask, what is your experience or your background or just, maybe your thoughts on diversity?
Well, that's a broad question. Let's put it this way. I have had the privilege of, traveling around the world. I am Indian born. So I was born in what was called Bombay back then, in the 70s. And my family grew up, and I grew up in the Middle East. So more specifically in the United Arab Emirates, in Dubai in particular.
Yeah.
And about 30 years ago, we moved to Canada. So, my time in Dubai was interesting because it gave me the opportunity to travel all over the world and experience cultures and peoples and traditions from everywhere. So I think that has contributed largely to my worldview. And then I moved to Canada in 95 and I chose to live out in Durham region. And Durham region at the time was not as diverse as it is today, but it was an interesting experience that has, that I've immersed myself in over the last 30 years. And it's been an interesting development to watch the demographic shift, to watch culture shift, and to just watch society in many ways adjust to that demographic shifts.
Got it. Yeah. And just for the audience, just in terms of background, I'm with the same story in the sense I too grew up in Dubai, and this is the old Dubai. It's definitely not the Dubai that it
Yeah.
is now, the Vegas Dubai. I think our
Yes.
tallest building back then was the Trade Center, which was maybe 30 floors or something.
Right. Yeah. No,
And
I tell people that all the time. It's not the Dubai you see on the internet today that I grew up in.
yeah, it was like Old Town Dubai. And even though, it was back then, it was a little bit smaller, less cosmopolitan, less expatriates. It was still very diverse with the cultures that were there. And you could see that with, the people, with the food, with the
Hmm.
religion, with the entertainment. And it was very
Hmm.
interesting because, I grew up in Dubai, but then, during summers, we'd go to India on holiday. And when I'd
Right.
go to India, they would say, hey, you're from Dubai. And
Right.
then, when I'd go to Dubai, they'd say, hey, you're from India. So I was always sort of
Right.
caught in between, right?
Hmm.
And even
Hmm.
something like India, a lot of people think India is India and all Indians are the same. But really, I think, just the name India is what unites the country. Again, you've got,
Sure.
different states that are pretty much like different countries, different religions, different cultures, different habits, mannerisms, drastically different, I think, too. Um,
Well, cuisine and from religious belief to cuisine to just everyday life, you're talking about a country with over 1 billion people, right? And
yeah.
I think regional differences will show and play out. And I think that's absolutely correct. I think that's a country with both religious language culture, traditional differences from region to region. So a tremendous amount of diversity that exists within it. I think it's one of the big reasons that when I travel around the world and people talk about being Indian, I say that there's no one monolithic definition of being Indian, because we are such a diverse peoples that it would be hard to generalize. In fact, it would be reductive and probably counterproductive.
That's a good point. That's reductive to do that because, if you look at the history of India, which goes back thousands and thousands of years to where, there's no early pictures or even paintings of, the rulers at the time, maybe they're inscripted on coins, it goes back that old. And it's been
Right.
drastically different from the type of people that have conquered India in terms of
Sure.
religious and cultures. So there's no sort of central foundation to that.
Yeah.
And you are right. Like coming to Canada, I also sort of came at the same time and into a
Mhm.
place where it wasn't as diverse at the time. And it was a very interesting contrast because I got to see what a monotone culture would sort of be like. And I
Mhm.
learned a lot from that. So from your experience, do you think people should, get into diversity and, establish the good habits of diversity, or is it better maybe just to stay monotone so you can be loyal and patriotic to your culture? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, to be honest, I don't think it's I don't think it's an or question. I think it's an and question. I think that it is possible to appreciate unique cultures and celebrate your roots, while also celebrating the way we come together as as people. My line, and I probably will use this too many times in this interview. I always talk about the importance of focusing on our common humanity, right? And our common humanity binds us as people, regardless of skin color, race, religion, any marker that we use to differentiate. I think that those are mostly immutable and superficial differences. Don't get me wrong. There's a lot of social context that goes with each of those things. But
Yeah,
at the end of the day, those are immutable differences that cannot truly define an individual. So the short answer to your question is, I think that our commitment to diversity as a community is extremely important for forward progress and our ability to cooperate with each other.
got it. And with the work that you've done in post-secondary, so if you look at something like education, what I love about going to a classroom is each student will ask a different question and they'll ask questions I would never think about. And I think
Mhm.
that's good because it moves things forward. It opens, new cans of worms and it
Mhm.
gets your thinking ahead, right? And you get to solve problems with diverse thinking, which brings about diverse solutions. If we
Sure.
had sort of education that was, very limited, again, tunnel vision and thinking, there wasn't a lot of sort of diverse thoughts that can
Mhm.
slow down maybe progress and evolution and things like that, right?
Well, I don't know about evolution, but I definitely think that viewpoint diversity within academic settings is extremely important. But I think that it has to go hand in hand with mutual respect for other people, right? So it is possible to have a lot of diverging views in a space. But in the absence of respect, mutual respect, that conversation can devolve really, really quickly. So there's a little bit of classroom management within an academic setting, but I think more important than managing the situation is having mutual respect for other people, because that gives us the room to have meaningful discourse while also accepting that our worldviews might differ from other people. And you want to stay away from that value judgment that actually makes most of those conversations result in polarization rather than cooperation. A central point, I think, to diversity is the willingness to accept that it must include other people and they must feel like they're part of the conversation as well. Otherwise, it becomes dogmatic.
Got it. Why do you think people might not have that respect? Is it because of, lack of knowledge, of maybe, ignorance or, not understanding?
I think it's a couple of things, right? I mean, a lot of our culture, North American culture, media culture, is focused around things that are easy to consume, short, small sound bites, um, information that is sensational, and that has a naturally divisive and polarizing effect, right? So you think about people that read a particular type of paper for a particular worldview, and That's fine. I'm all for diversity of viewpoint and ideology. But here's the thing. If you're not getting a well-rounded picture, then you're really living in an echo chamber. And it's that living in an echo chamber that reinforces your worldview at the exclusion of any other perspective. And that is the part I think that leads to polarization. And that's the part that I believe leads to a lack of respect. So I don't know that I would call it ignorance because we live in a time when information is freely available. The
Hmm.
question is, are we motivated to open our perspective and consider positions that we don't inherently agree with?
So maybe there's a little bit of fear peppered in there.
Oh, absolutely. I think I don't want to be overly, I don't want to overly generalize, but I think we do have by nature, we tend to be a little tribalistic. We tend to like to stay with our own. And by our own, I mean, however we identify, right? People have a way of coalescing around others who share their thoughts and experiences and opinions. And that's fine. It builds community, it builds some sort of connection, but it can also isolate you from the larger community. And that's where I'm suggesting fear is often a byproduct of the unknown, right? And so I think that's a problem.
Got it. Yeah, and that's where, if ignorance is, one of the causes, then fear is the byproduct of that ignorance, right?
Sure. I did a TED talk in the TEDx talk in 2022, and I actually called it How Our Common Humanity Gets Lost in the Jargon of Inclusivity. And what I'm talking about there is that narrow focus on, particular tribalistic thinking or a fear of engagement. I often talk about that. A lot of people don't see themselves in the conversation. And so they become fearful and then don't engage. And I think that has a corrosive effect on society in the long run.
Got it, fearful. Because if you have that fear, it's going to stop you from being curious and, figuring out what it is that you're fearful of, which most of the times it's just a mental phobia, right? And then if you
Yeah,
get stopped at that point in time, you're not going to go forward and you might not, you know, get something that, you were missing out in life and you thought was, really important.
oh, absolutely. I mean, and this is where exposure and a willingness to have broader perspectives included are important. But you're right. Fear will drive people inwards, and anytime you're driven inwards, you're less likely to explore positions that make you uncomfortable, right?
God, and when you go inward, I imagine that's when, judgment kicks in and critique and the stereotypes and the labeling and all of those things.
Sure. So I mean, I've always made this. I say it in jest, but I think there's an element of truth to it. Regardless of race, religion, color, gender, we all have some prejudice and some bias within us. And my constant, in humorous moments, I say most of our prejudices develop at our kitchen table at home. Right. And we're influenced by our upbringing. We're influenced by our generation. We're influenced by those around us. The problem is, do we just carry them without challenging them throughout our life? Or do we gain more perspective as we move? And that is where I think, the opportunity lies. It's fine to have any number of views within your household, but it's a question of, are you willing to grow outside of that, right?
Got it. No, I like those points of perspective. And earlier you mentioned respect, because if you start with respect, it'll, open up your perspective to diversity. And I'm reminded of, I believe it's Daryl Davis, who's an African gentleman who actually meets with KKK clan members. And he's met
Mm-hmm.
with, leaders who are high up in that organization. He's actually attended events and rallies, and
Mm-hmm.
he's gone beyond that to actually sit one-on-one with them in a hotel room. And,
Right.
learning about him, listening to his interviews, he's actually converted some of these people out of the KKK
Sure.
because once they got to know him, again, they had the respect to sit down, and then the perspective changed, right? After the conversation with him. And then you realize, we're more alike than we are different.
Absolutely. Now, I think those are rare, or those are special, extraordinary circumstances that the average person might not be able to relate to. And I always talk about this, the power of ordinary, right? We should not set the bar sometimes so high that it's easy to give ourselves a pass and say, well, I can't do that. I think everyday people, everyday folk in everyday life can make meaningful changes if they're willing to, right? And you mentioned something about finding commonality there. So I often use this line, you have to know me. It's an old business adage, I didn't make it up. But you have to know me to like me. You have to like me to trust me. You have to trust me to want to work with me. And all of it begins with knowing me, right? So if you apply that at a more macro level, then our first step to building trust and building working cooperation is getting to know people. And to your point there, once you get to know people, oftentimes you're going to find that we do have more in common than we have that differentiates us.
Correct. And, traveling used to be the way that you could, go outside of your comfort zone, outside of your immediate environment, and go somewhere foreign, from North America, just say to the Far East, where people are doing things completely different. And now with, the insurgence of the internet, you don't have to travel. You can actually see it in your, your feeds and in the news and in your interactions with people. And, like you're saying, it's a small world, and it's a similar world as well, right?
Mm-hmm. I don't want to sound, I think it can be interpreted as classist or elitist, and I don't want to sound that way. I think there's nothing that substitutes for actually traveling around the world and seeing people. The problem is with cost of living today, that's from North America, that's a big ask, right? Traveling the world is a big ask for the average family, and it's not always attainable. So to your point, the internet can bridge some of that gap. We saw it during the pandemic when people were doing world tours from their living rooms. And it's sometimes easier when you're in Europe or you're in the Middle East because you're a little bit more centrally located and travel's a little bit more affordable for the average family.
Yeah.
But I always return to that. There's something about seeing people outside of a screen, outside of a TV, that really brings you and immerses you into a culture.
No, definitely 100%. I agree with that. Nothing like, being there live where the action is, submersed in the culture. And for those people, who maybe don't have the ability to travel, maybe because of time, finances, in a place like, say, Toronto, Canada, which is, comprised of very many different cultures, that come here, that immigrate here, and that are able to maintain, the status of their culture, as well, the mannerisms of their culture. And they have, various festivals throughout the year. People can visit those festivals, right, and get a sense of the food, the community, the entertainment, things like that.
Absolutely. And I'm a big advocate. So I'm a big advocate for being in the community and participating in a diverse range of experiences. So you're absolutely right. Most of the big cities in Canada today have a majority minority population, which means that there's no shortage of culture on offer available if you're willing to engage with it. And sometimes that's a mindset, right? You got to go out and you got to experience it. And I live in Durham region, and Durham region is increasingly diverse. I think our latest census data says that I think 36%, somewhere around there, of Durham's population is a visible minority, which is interesting because it has a way of changing the culture. That's one of the things I try to do with my monthly column where I write for Metroland Media and DurhamRegion.com. And I write about community and culture. And my whole purpose of that column that I write is to highlight stories of people from all over the world that are new in Durham region and talk about how we take those worldly experiences and use it proactively to build community here. I think there's a consistency you will find across most of my work, and that is how do I bring people together? And that's one of the reasons I took on that column for Metroland, because to me, it humanizes, it puts a face and a story behind a statistic.
So speaking with the work you do with writing and with publication, I mean, currently we're speaking on culture and, the interactions between humans. So now diversity in the organization, right, in the workplace. How important is it implementing the concept of diversity, maybe in your writing style or, even with the publication inventory that you have?
I think so. I think the publishing, just to put some context behind it, when you're talking about my publication business, my partner Brian Sankersing and myself own a company called Sankersing Gonsalves Productions. We have a publication that runs on Substack. That's the platform we use. It's called Seeking Veritas, with the professor, the poet, and friends. And that was an important thing. So, I identify as the professor. My friend Brian is very much the poet, but we also have made room right in the title to have a diverse set of writers work with us. And we have some wonderful people that we have that don't share our perspectives necessarily, but have a perspective that is unique. And we're always looking for new and emerging talent, and we're trying to bring their voice and give them a platform. But right now, we have a writing partner that writes from just outside of New Delhi in India. We have somebody that writes from Calgary. We have a couple of people from Toronto. So we have people from everywhere, and we try to tell stories from very, very different perspectives because I believe in the value of viewpoint diversity, right? I think that's truly the value of having a team, if you will. So when you talk about organizational culture, I think it's so much more than just representation. I think representation is important, but it is only one factor. Viewpoint diversity, having a difference in ideology, all of these things make for richer organizations. And I think sometimes we stop at representation, and I think we're missing a lot of opportunities there.
No, that's true because when we say diversity in the organization, it's the representation and inclusion, and that's where the buck usually stops. But that third step, getting into viewpoint, is where the magic happens, right? Because all these writers from different parts of the world that contribute their ideology to your company, that's actually affecting the brand of your company, right?
Absolutely. I mean, viewpoint diversity and celebrating multiple perspectives, regardless of whether I, as the co-founder, agree with it or not, was very much the basis that Brian and I built this company on. We didn't want to cater and create a new echo chamber for one set of ideas. So 100%. When I say representation, I think you're right. It's what you actually end up with is a lot of tokenism, right? We have a brown person, we have a black person, we have a woman. And those are very, very limiting beliefs in my mind, because how do you generalize and reduce a person to just the color of their skin? You can't. So, you need to know what they're thinking and how they're feeling about things. And that's really where the magic happens, to use your term.
Has there anything that has been an aha moment or stood out, being with the diverse staff that you have? Anything you've learned, or something that popped up in your head, or that's made you in a better way? Or
Oh, absolutely. I'm challenged. I'm challenged almost daily from my interactions. But I will share with you one. And this one goes back to my writing partner, Brian Sankersing. So we wrote a book called A Broken Soul. It's a men's mental health short story. And Brian writes beautifully, but Brian primarily writes poetry. And I don't write poetry. I'm not a poet. So we told this fictional story that we were trying to talk about men and mental health and the way men experience it, especially immigrant men in Canada. And one of the things that I realized very quickly was there's very different ways to reach an audience. So Brian and I had the same view. We need men to be willing to talk and engage, but the way we come about it is very, very different. So I used a very dramatic story. He interjected with poems that we went in between. And that blending of poetry and storytelling just worked out beautifully. But what it did, more importantly, was it allowed us to reach more people. And that was a takeaway, because sometimes I am equally guilty of thinking, well, this strategy works for me. This is my writing style. And then you run with it. And then you are introduced to somebody who is completely different from you. And it's in that original acceptance that you start to see when they have a different view, you become more receptive because you start to value how they reach people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. And that's true for not only business partners, but, for spouses who are married too, right? Too often we think we want someone who's the same like us, but really that polar opposite is what sort of balances out, the whole spousal relationship sometimes, right? Or the business partner relationship. Like, your strengths are your strengths. Your partner Brian's strengths in business are his strengths, and they might not necessarily align with yours, and that's a good thing, because that'll overcompensate for, the weaknesses that you'll have as well, right?
Sure. I mean, it's the differing perspectives that bring value and actually allows us to come up with better ideas. But to your point, I think your point was dead on. It is just as valid in personal settings inside of a marriage. I wrote an article for the CBC First Person, and it was all about parenting biracial children. So, we were talking about diversity within the family and the manner in which you talk about it. You can check that article out on CBC. But what is really neat about that story that I was telling there was I was talking about the real struggles people face at home, and we're seeing diversity not just in the workplace, and it's not just an ideology or a checkbox or something we do as an activity. But I say this all the time. Diversity is, equity, diversity, inclusion. These are operating principles. They're foundational principles for life, for business, for work. It doesn't really matter. They're foundational principles. They are not activities. When you do them as an activity, that's when you're checking a box. When you live them, though, that's when you see value.
Got it. And living is not just, signing in of work, signing out. It's also
No.
interacting with the person, having a conversation with them, getting to know them, their family, their background, their culture, the food they eat, right? Things like that.
Absolutely. There's an old saying that you never really know somebody until you break bread with them. I truly believe that. Now, it might be because I'm a foodie and I love to check out restaurants, but I think that there's something to be said. You have to see the person, right? Not the narrative, not the brand. We all live in this Instagram world or the social media world where we're very good at cultivating and curating avatars of ourselves that we're very proud of. Sometimes you just need to relax and go get to know people.
Correct. Yeah. And, earlier I'd mentioned evolution, not necessarily evolution in the biological sense. Yeah, I mean, I haven't researched that, but evolution in, your thought sense and how you grow and evolve as a person to give you a different, viewpoint in life. And I hearken back to, my early days of religion. We grew up in a Catholic school, so we were taught the Catholic doctrine. And then it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't until I came here and I sort of, started studying Hinduism and Buddhism, and that just completely, 180 degrees changed my whole worldview on religion, on God. My whole perception of God changed, right?
Sure.
Because I was immersed in how another culture thinks about God, which was very
Right.
different than the culture I grew up, thinking about God. And it, made me a better person to try to understand what God is and things like that.
I love reading about religion. I love experiencing other people's religious beliefs because there's something, it's funny. I have found that if I just recently written an article on Seeking Veritas, where I talked about what we have in common between faiths and traditions. And you actually start to find that at its core, we really do have a lot in common. Now, I was once at a Gurdwara doing a tour and getting to know the folks there. And it was one of the most beautiful explanations somebody gave me. He said, it doesn't matter what we name or call God. Now, this is his perspective, and this is the way he shared it, and I respect the fact that it was his view. He said, God's, at the top of a mountain. Imagine that. And all of us of different faiths and different traditions and different religions are going up this mountain on different sides. And we might call things by a different name. We might practice it slightly differently. But at the end, we're trying to get to what we believe is good so we can live a fulfilled life. And, there's some wisdom in that. So doctrine is important and dogma can be problematic, but humanity is really what binds us, right?
Correct. And I think it's this sort of dichotomy of there is a foundation that is very monotone, but from that foundation stems the diversity of the universe, which is the atoms, the people, the worlds, etc. And both are sort of coexisting at the same time. So, earlier you said it shouldn't be black and white. I think also from what you're saying, it should be both operating at the same time. Then you're sort of in a good way.
Yeah, I think anytime you get into an or dilemma, what we end up with is binary thinking, right? It has to be one or zero, black or white, whichever way you want to think about it. And I think it's often life doesn't operate that way. A lot of life is nuanced and it exists in the gray. So if I might, I'd leave you with, with three things I share with everybody. And this is really, if I was to do anything, I would say this is the foundation of all of my work. It is the 3 points that bind all of this. One is consistency of application. So regardless of who you're talking to, where you are you consistent in your foundational principles that you operate by? Second is clarity of communication. Do you clearly state And are you clearly expressing and communicating in the right way? Because that's where a lot of things break down. And three, are you managing for risk? Are you being diligent? Are you taking other people into consideration? And I think that if you do those three things, if you have consistency of application, clarity of communication, and mitigation of risk, you're probably on pretty stable ground to do some good, meaningful work in the community.
No, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. And that's not only for, human interaction, that those laws of success, those three laws, they apply to work as well. So, and, living a, a good life too. So, no, thanks for sharing that. And let's see where it
My
goes. I
pleasure.
mean, we started as, like you said, tribal people. We each had
Mm-hmm.
our own cultures, throughout the world. How we ended up there, there's still a gap in evolution, but, and then, we've seen through the years as, people travel, cross, conquer continents and,
Mm-hmm.
intermingle with, the different cultures. We are getting, more diverse as a race. And let's see whether, this goes in the future. Maybe it'll just be a completely, homogenous race, everyone blended into each other, that all of humanity becomes one race, right? Which is a diverse race. So let's see
Yeah,
what.
I'm gonna, if I might, if you don't mind, I'm gonna push back. There's a new book coming out next year. It's not out yet, but it's by a fabulous writer named Dr. Sheena Mason, and it's called The Raceless Anti-Racist. I would encourage people to check out that book. It's going to be a good one. It's going to be an idea worth exploring, and really, one of the key points I took away from when I read it for the purpose of reviewing it was that in order to get rid of racism and in order to get rid of prejudice, we really have to reevaluate the way we talk and think about race in its first place. It's very much a thing that we have challenged biologically, its existence. Socially, we see the challenges with categorizing people in such limited ways.
Mhm.
But follow the experts. And I would suggest, if I was going to leave you with a book recommendation, because I'm an avid reader and I do that every week,
Yeah.
my book recommendation for 2024 is The Raceless Anti-Racist, and by Dr. Sheena Mason. I would check it out.
Okay, great. And I'll put that in the show notes as well. And finally, if people want to get a hold of you or check out your work, where's the best place to reach you?
LinkedIn. LinkedIn is the absolute best place to reach me. I'm very, very active on there. So Neil, Neil, Gonsalves, Gonsalves. You can find me on LinkedIn, message me on LinkedIn. That's one of the easiest ways to get a hold of me. And then I'm on Instagram as well, Professor Gonsalves, at Professor Gonsalves is my handle. And either of those ways are great ways to get a hold of me.
Okay, amazing. I'll put those in the show notes under the contact field. Thanks again for coming on the show, and I wish you well.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.